Some moments arrive disguised as ordinary routine, slipping past our defenses when we least expect them. They hide behind familiar sounds, predictable schedules, and the comfortable rhythm of daily life. But, beneath the surface, they carry the power to shatter everything we thought we knew about the people around us. In places where hundreds of strangers gather daily, where conversations blend into background noise and faces become forgettable, the most shocking revelations often happen in plain sight. A single glance, a momentary pause, or the glimpse of something that shouldn't be there can transform a mundane Tuesday afternoon into a life-altering encounter. What would you do if a routine moment revealed a truth so disturbing that it forced you to question everything you believed about human nature? Sometimes the most dangerous secrets hide in the most public places, waiting for the right person to notice what everyone else has chosen to ignore. Detective Sarah Martinez had always prided herself on noticing details that others missed. After 15 years working various cases across the city, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot inconsistencies, lies, and hidden truths. But nothing in her extensive training had prepared her for what she would discover during what started as the most routine search of her career. The Lincoln Community Center had served the downtown area for over 3 decades. Every weekday, it buzzed with activity as dozens of people came and went for various programs, meetings, and services. The large mess hall on the second floor was particularly busy during lunch hours, serving hot meals to anyone who needed them, regardless of their circumstances. The atmosphere was usually warm and welcoming, filled with the chatter of conversations, the clinking of utensils, and the steady hum of people finding comfort in shared meals. On this particular Tuesday in September, Detective Martinez received what seemed like a straightforward assignment. The community center's director, Mrs. Patricia Hoffman, had called the police station early that morning, her voice tight with concern. Several expensive items had gone missing from the center over the past few weeks, including laptops from the computer lab, cash from fundraising events, and personal belongings of both staff and visitors. The thefts were becoming more frequent and more brazen, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and unease among the regular attendees. Mrs. Hoffman, a woman in her early 60s who had dedicated her life to community service, met Detective Martinez at the front entrance. Her usually bright demeanor seemed dimmed by worry, and she wrung her hands as she explained the situation. The missing items weren't just about monetary value, she explained. The community center operated on a tight budget, and every stolen laptop or missing donation meant fewer resources for the people who depended on their services. It's not just about the things that are being taken, Mrs. Hoffman said as she led Detective Martinez through the building's corridors. It's about trust. People come here because they feel safe, because they know they can rely on us. When someone is stealing from the very place that's trying to help them, it breaks something fundamental about what we're trying to achieve here. Detective Martinez nodded, understanding the deeper implications. Community centers like this one often served as lifelines for people who had nowhere else to turn. The loss of trust could be far more damaging than the loss of any material possession. The search was methodical and systematic. Detective Martinez started with the computer lab, examining the remaining equipment and checking for any signs of forced entry or tampering. She interviewed staff members, volunteers, and several regular visitors, taking notes on their observations and any suspicious behavior they might have witnessed. Most people were cooperative, eager to help solve the mystery that was casting a shadow over their community space. As the afternoon wore on, Detective Martinez made her way to the mess hall. The lunch rush had ended about an hour earlier, but several people still lingered at tables, some reading newspapers, others engaged in quiet conversations, and a few individuals who seemed to be using the space simply as a place to rest and stay warm. The smell of the day's meal, a hearty vegetable soup and fresh bread, still hung in the air. She began her inspection by checking the storage areas and kitchen spaces where valuable items might be hidden. The kitchen staff, led by a cheerful woman named Rosa who had worked there for 8 years, showed her around every corner of their workspace. Rosa mentioned that she had noticed some unusual behavior recently, people lingering after meals longer than usual, and a few individuals asking detailed questions about the center's schedule and when different areas would be empty. "There's this one guy," Rosa said, lowering her voice and glancing toward the dining area. "He comes in almost every day, always sits at the same table over there by the window. He's polite enough, doesn't cause any trouble, but there's something about him that makes me uncomfortable.
He watches people, you know? Like he's studying them. Detective Martinez followed Rosa's gaze to a table near the large windows that overlooked the parking lot. Currently empty, it provided an excellent view of both the entrance to the mess hall and most of the dining area. It would indeed be an ideal spot for someone who wanted to observe patterns and behaviors. She decided to spend some time in the mess hall, observing the people who came and went, looking for anything that might seem out of place. Detective Martinez had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to catch a thief was to understand the environment they were operating in, to see what they saw and think like they might think. As she settled at a table with a cup of coffee that Rosa had insisted on providing, Detective Martinez began to study the afternoon crowd. There was an elderly man reading a worn paperback novel, his fingers carefully turning each page as if the book were a precious treasure. Near the serving area, two women were engaged in an animated discussion about their children, their voices rising and falling with emotion. A younger man, probably in his 20s, sat alone at a corner table, occasionally glancing up from his phone to scan the room. It was then that she noticed him. A man, probably in his 40s, who matched Rosa's description almost perfectly. He sat at the table by the window, methodically eating what appeared to be a late lunch, but his eyes rarely focused on his food. Instead, he seemed to be cataloging every person in the room, noting who came and went, how long they stayed, and what they carried with them. There was something calculated about his presence that immediately caught Detective Martinez's attention. While everyone else in the mess hall seemed to be there for the obvious reasons, seeking a meal, companionship, or simply a warm place to spend time, this man appeared to be working. His posture was alert despite his casual appearance, and his eyes moved with the systematic precision of someone conducting surveillance. Detective Martinez decided to observe him more closely, using her peripheral vision while pretending to review her notes from the day's interviews. The man was well dressed for someone seeking services at a community center, his clothes clean and relatively new. His shoes were expensive, she noticed, the kind that someone truly struggling financially wouldn't likely own. These details began to form a pattern that didn't quite fit with the typical profile of the center's usual visitors. After about 20 minutes, the man finished his meal and stood to leave. As he pushed back from his table, Detective Martinez caught a glimpse of something that made her heart rate quicken. When he reached up to adjust his collar, his sleeve rode up slightly, revealing part of a tattoo on his forearm. It wasn't the presence of a tattoo that alarmed her, tattoos were common enough, but rather the specific design she could partially see. The visible portion appeared to be part of a larger piece, but even the small section she could make out was distinctive enough to trigger a memory. It looked like part of a symbol she had encountered before in her law enforcement career, during a case that still gave her nightmares when she thought about it too deeply. 3 years earlier, Detective Martinez had worked on a case involving a sophisticated identity theft ring that had been operating across several states. The criminals had been remarkably organized, using community centers, libraries, and other public spaces to gather information about potential victims. They would spend weeks observing people, learning their routines, their financial situations, and their personal details, all while appearing to be just another face in the crowd. The leader of that ring had been a man named David Chen, and he had been distinctive for many reasons, not least of which was an elaborate tattoo that covered most of his right forearm. The tattoo was a complex design that incorporated elements from several different cultural traditions, but at its center was a symbol that looked almost like a compass rose, with intricate details that made it unmistakable once you had seen it. Detective Martinez felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that the partial tattoo she had just glimpsed bore a striking resemblance to David Chen's distinctive ink. But that was impossible, wasn't it? David Chen was supposed to be in federal prison, serving a 15-year sentence for his crimes. She had testified at his trial herself, had watched as the judge handed down the sentence that was supposed to keep him locked away until well into the next decade. But, as the man walked toward the exit of the mess hall, Detective Martinez found herself studying his build, his gait, and his general appearance with new eyes. David Chen had been a master of disguise, able to alter his appearance significantly through changes in weight, hair color, and style of dress. Could this man, who had been so systematically observing the community center's operations, actually be Chen? The possibility sent a surge of adrenaline through Detective Martinez's system. If David Chen was somehow free and operating again, it meant that not only was the community center dealing with petty theft, but
they might be facing something much more dangerous. Chen's operation had ruined hundreds of lives, stealing not just money and possessions but entire identities, leaving victims to spend years trying to rebuild their credit, their reputations, and their sense of security. As the man reached the exit, he paused and turned back toward the dining area, his eyes sweeping across the room one final time. For just a moment, his gaze met Detective Martinez's, and she felt a jolt of recognition pass between them. There was something in his eyes, a calculating intelligence combined with a hint of amusement, that she remembered all too well from her encounters with David Chen. The man smiled slightly, an expression that didn't reach his eyes, and then he was gone, disappearing through the doorway and into the late afternoon bustle of the community center's main corridor. Detective Martinez sat frozen for a moment, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just happened. If her suspicions were correct, then everything about this case had just changed. What had started as a simple investigation into some missing laptops and petty theft had potentially become something much more serious. She needed to act quickly but carefully, because if this really was David Chen, then he was already several steps ahead of everyone else, and he wouldn't hesitate to disappear again if he suspected that his cover had been blown. Detective Martinez quickly gathered her things and headed toward the exit, hoping to catch another glimpse of the suspicious man, but when she reached the main corridor, he was nowhere to be seen. The community center had multiple exits, and by now he could have left through any one of them, or he could still be somewhere in the building, blending in with the crowd of people who used the various services and programs. Standing in the busy hallway, surrounded by the normal sounds and activities of the community center, Detective Martinez felt the weight of what she might have discovered. If she was right, then the routine search for a petty thief had just uncovered something much more significant, something that could have far-reaching implications not just for this community center, but for law enforcement agencies across multiple states. But she also knew that she needed to be absolutely certain before she made any accusations or took any dramatic action. The consequences of being wrong could be severe, not just for her career but for an innocent person who might simply have a tattoo that resembled something from her past. She needed evidence, solid proof that would confirm her suspicions beyond any reasonable doubt. As she stood there, planning her next moves, Detective Martinez couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The sensation was subtle but persistent, the kind of awareness that comes from years of police work and countless situations where attention to such feelings had meant the difference between safety and danger. She looked around the corridor, trying to identify the source of her unease, but everyone seemed to be going about their normal business. Children were running toward the after-school program rooms, elderly visitors were making their way to various activities, and staff members were moving between different areas with the purposeful efficiency of people who had important work to do. Yet the feeling persisted, and Detective Martinez realized that her investigation had just entered a new and potentially dangerous phase. If her suspicions about the man's identity were correct, then she was now dealing with someone who had already proven himself to be extremely cunning, resourceful, and willing to go to great lengths to avoid capture. The routine search was over. What came next would be anything but routine. Detective Martinez spent the next 3 days conducting the most careful investigation of her career. She couldn't simply walk into her captain's office and announce that she believed a federal fugitive might be operating out of a local community center based on a partially glimpsed tattoo. She needed concrete evidence, but she also needed to work quickly and quietly to avoid alerting her suspect that he had been identified. Her first step was to contact the Federal Bureau's database system to verify David Chen's current status. What she discovered sent another chill through her system. According to the records, David Chen had been released from federal prison 6 months earlier, 2 years before his scheduled release date, as part of a prison overcrowding reduction program. The notification that should have been sent to local law enforcement agencies about his release had somehow been lost in bureaucratic shuffles, meaning that police departments in areas where Chen had previously operated had no idea he was free. This revelation transformed Detective Martinez's suspicions into a much more urgent reality. Chen wasn't supposed to be in prison anymore, but he also wasn't supposed to be operating freely without proper supervision and notification to local authorities. His release conditions included regular check-ins with a parole officer, restrictions on travel, and specific prohibitions against activities that could facilitate identity theft or fraud. Armed with this new information, Detective Martinez began building a comprehensive surveillance plan. She couldn't conduct round-the-clock monitoring alone, but she also couldn't risk involving too many people until she was absolutely certain of Chen's identity and intentions. She decided to focus her efforts on the community center during the times when the suspicious man had been observed, particularly during the afternoon hours when he seemed to favor the mess hall's window table. On Thursday afternoon, Detective Martinez positioned herself across the street from the community center in an unmarked vehicle, using binoculars and a camera with a telephoto lens to observe the building's entrances and exits. She had studied David Chen's case file extensively the night before, refreshing her memory about his methods, his preferences, and his physical characteristics. Even accounting for possible changes in weight, hair color, and style of dress, she felt increasingly confident that the man she had observed was indeed Chen. At approximately 2:15 p.m., she spotted him entering the building through the main entrance. Today he was dressed differently, wearing a baseball cap and a jacket that partially concealed his build, but his manner of walking and the way he scanned his surroundings were unmistakably familiar. Detective Martinez waited 15 minutes before following him into the building, timing her entry to coincide with a group of visitors so that her presence would seem less conspicuous. Once inside, she made her way to the mess hall, where she found Chen, or the man she believed to be Chen, sitting at his usual table by the window. This time, however, she was prepared with a small, concealed camera that could capture detailed images without drawing attention. She positioned herself at a table that provided a clear view of his profile while appearing to review paperwork related to her ongoing investigation into the community center's thefts. Over the course of the next hour, Detective Martinez was able to observe Chen's activities with much greater detail than during her previous encounter. She watched as he engaged in what appeared to be casual conversations with other visitors, but she noticed that his questions were consistently focused on gathering personal information. He would ask about people's living situations, their family members, their work schedules, and their financial circumstances, all under the guise of friendly conversation. More disturbing was his systematic approach to documenting this information. Chen carried a small notebook, and he would occasionally jot down details during his conversations, always doing so in a way that seemed natural and unremarkable to his conversation partners. Detective Martinez realized she was witnessing the early stages of Chen's identity theft operation, the careful intelligence gathering that would later enable him to steal identities and commit fraud. But the most conclusive evidence came when Chen removed his jacket due to the warmth of the mess hall. With his sleeves rolled up, the tattoo on his right forearm was clearly visible, and Detective Martinez was able to capture several detailed photographs. The tattoo was unmistakably the same one she remembered from David Chen's case file, complete with the distinctive compass rose design and the intricate cultural symbols that surrounded it. Armed with photographic evidence and her observations of Chen's behavior, Detective Martinez felt confident enough to take the next step in her investigation. However, she also realized that she was dealing with a situation that extended far beyond the simple thefts that had originally brought her to the community center. Chen's presence suggested a much larger criminal operation in the planning stages, one that could potentially victimize dozens or even hundreds of people if allowed to proceed unchecked. That evening, Detective Martinez contacted Agent Rebecca Torres of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who had been the lead federal agent on the original David Chen case. Agent Torres was stunned to learn that Chen was not only free but potentially active again, and she immediately began coordinating with local law enforcement to develop a comprehensive response plan. "This is exactly what we were afraid might happen," Agent Torres told Detective Martinez during their phone conversation.
Chen's early release was controversial from the beginning.
He's incredibly intelligent, highly skilled at what he does, and completely without remorse for the damage he causes to his victims.
If he's setting up another operation, we need to stop him before he can fully implement it.
The next day, Friday, Detective Martinez returned to the community center with backup from 2 additional detectives and a federal agent who could provide expertise on identity theft operations. They maintained surveillance from multiple positions, both inside and outside the building, while also working to gather additional evidence of Chen's activities. What they discovered was even more alarming than Detective Martinez had initially suspected.
Chen wasn't working alone.
Over the course of the day, they observed him meeting with at least 3 other individuals at different times and locations within the community center. These meetings were brief and appeared casual, but the systematic nature of the contacts suggested a coordinated effort. One of Chen's associates was a woman in her 30s who spent considerable time in the computer lab, ostensibly learning to use the internet and email. However, the surveillance team noticed that she was actually using her time to access personal information left on shared computers by previous users, as well as to observe the login credentials of other people using the lab. She had positioned herself at a terminal that provided a clear view of several other screens, and she was systematically recording information that could later be used for identity theft. Another associate was an older man who frequented the center's job search and career counseling services. He engaged in lengthy conversations with other job seekers, gathering detailed information about their employment histories, their financial situations, and their personal circumstances. Under the pretense of offering mutual support and advice, he was actually collecting the precise information that identity thieves need to successfully impersonate their victims. The third associate was perhaps the most disturbing, because his target demographic appeared to be the center's most vulnerable visitors. He focused his attention on elderly individuals who came to the center for social interaction and support services. These conversations often centered around family relationships, medical issues, and financial concerns, all topics that could provide valuable information for someone planning to steal an identity or commit elder fraud. As the surveillance team observed these activities over the course of several hours, they began to understand the scope and sophistication of Chen's operation. This wasn't a simple case of petty theft or even individual identity theft. Instead, they were looking at what appeared to be a large-scale criminal enterprise designed to systematically harvest personal information from some of the community's most vulnerable residents. The community center's warm, trusting atmosphere made it an ideal hunting ground for this type of criminal activity. People came there seeking help, support, and companionship, making them naturally more open to sharing personal information with seemingly friendly strangers. The center's open layout and multiple programs created numerous opportunities for criminals to blend in and interact with potential victims without raising suspicion. Detective Martinez felt a deep sense of anger as she realized how Chen and his associates were exploiting the very qualities that made the community center such a valuable resource for the people who needed it most. They were taking advantage of trust, kindness, and vulnerability in ways that could destroy not only individual lives but also the community bonds that places like this were designed to foster. By late afternoon, the surveillance team had gathered enough evidence to begin planning their next moves. They had photographs of all 4 suspected criminals, documentation of their activities, and evidence that they were operating a coordinated scheme to gather personal information for fraudulent purposes. However, they also faced a complex tactical situation. Simply arresting Chen and his associates immediately might prevent them from committing additional crimes at the community center, but it would also likely shut down only one small part of what was probably a much larger criminal network. Chen had always been known for his extensive connections and his ability to operate multiple schemes simultaneously across different geographic areas. Agent Torres advocated for a more comprehensive approach that would involve continued surveillance, the use of undercover agents, and coordination with federal task forces in other cities where Chen might have operations. The goal would be to map out his entire criminal network and gather enough evidence to prosecute not just the immediate players but also the broader organization that supported their activities. Detective Martinez supported this approach but also felt a strong sense of urgency about protecting the community center's visitors from further exploitation. Every day that Chen's operation continued meant more potential victims and more lives that could be damaged by identity theft and fraud. As the day's surveillance came to an end, Detective Martinez watched Chen leave the community center through a side exit, disappearing into the early evening crowd on the sidewalk outside. She had the unsettling realization that he might already be aware that he was being watched. Chen had always been extremely perceptive about law enforcement presence, and his years in prison had likely only sharpened his instincts for detecting surveillance. That night, as she reviewed the day's observations and planned for the weekend's activities, Detective Martinez couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Chen had demonstrated throughout his criminal career that he was quick to adapt and willing to abandon operations if he sensed that law enforcement was closing in. If he suspected that his cover had been blown, he and his associates could disappear overnight, leaving behind only their victims and the damage they had already caused. The routine search for missing laptops and petty theft had evolved into something much more complex and dangerous. Detective Martinez realized that she was now involved in a high-stakes game of cat and mouse with one of the most sophisticated criminal minds she had ever encountered, and the safety and financial security of dozens of innocent people hung in the balance. As she prepared for what she knew would be a challenging weekend of surveillance and investigation, Detective Martinez made a silent promise to herself and to the people who depended on the community center for support and services. She would not allow David Chen to destroy another community, steal another identity, or shatter another person's trust in their fellow human beings. The routine search was over, but the real work was just beginning. The weekend brought an unexpected development that changed everything about Detective Martinez's careful surveillance operation. On Saturday morning, she received an urgent call from Mrs. Hoffman at the community center. Someone had broken into the building overnight, but, strangely, nothing appeared to be missing. Instead, the intruder seemed to have been searching through files and records, particularly those containing information about the center's regular visitors and program participants. Detective Martinez arrived at the scene within 20 minutes, accompanied by Agent Torres and a forensics team. What they found was both disturbing and revealing. The break-in had been executed with professional precision, leaving minimal physical evidence but clear signs that someone with extensive knowledge of the building's layout and security systems had gained access to the most sensitive areas of the facility. The intruder had focused primarily on the administrative offices, where files containing personal information about visitors were stored. Medical records, financial assistance applications, emergency contact forms, and program registration documents had all been accessed and, apparently, photographed or copied. The method was sophisticated, involving the use of portable scanning equipment that could digitize documents quickly and quietly. "This isn't random," Agent Torres observed as she examined the scene. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it. They had detailed knowledge of the center's record-keeping systems and security procedures." Detective Martinez nodded, but her attention was focused on a more disturbing possibility. If David Chen and his associates were responsible for this break-in, it meant that their operation was much further advanced than anyone had realized. They weren't just gathering information through casual conversations anymore, they were conducting systematic intelligence collection that could support identity theft on a massive scale. The forensics team found traces of advanced equipment that confirmed Detective Martinez's suspicions. Residual toner particles suggested the use of portable document scanners, while electromagnetic signatures indicated the presence of sophisticated electronic devices designed for data collection and transmission. This wasn't the work of typical criminals looking for quick cash or easily resold items. Mrs. Hoffman was devastated by the violation of her facility and the potential exposure of her visitors' private information. "These people trust us," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "They come here because they need help, because they believe we'll protect their privacy and treat them with dignity. How can I look them in the eye knowing that someone might be using their personal information to hurt them?" Detective Martinez understood Mrs. Hoffman's anguish, but she also saw an opportunity in the situation. The break-in had escalated the timeline and potentially forced Chen to accelerate his plans, which might create opportunities for law enforcement to intercept him before he could fully implement his scheme or disappear again. Agent Torres coordinated with federal cybercrime specialists to analyze the electronic traces left behind by the intruder's equipment. Within hours, they had identified the specific types of devices used and were able to trace their recent purchase to a series of transactions that led back to members of Chen's network. This electronic trail provided the concrete evidence needed to obtain federal warrants for surveillance and arrest operations. Meanwhile, Detective Martinez worked with the community center staff to implement immediate security measures and to begin the delicate process of notifying visitors whose information might have been compromised. This was a complex undertaking, because they needed to warn people about potential identity theft without creating panic or destroying the trust that made the community center effective. On Sunday evening, the investigation took another dramatic turn when surveillance teams observed Chen and his associates meeting at a warehouse facility across town. The meeting appeared to be a planning session for the final phase of their operation, involving the review of stolen information and the coordination of fraudulent activities that would target dozens of victims simultaneously. Federal agents had positioned listening devices near the warehouse, and what they heard confirmed their worst fears about the scope of Chen's operation. He and his team had collected detailed personal information on more than 80 individuals, ranging from elderly community center visitors to families seeking assistance with job placement and financial counseling. They had enough information to steal identities, apply for credit cards and loans, and potentially destroy the financial lives of every single person on their target list. But they also heard something that provided hope for stopping the operation before it could cause maximum damage. Chen's team was planning to execute their scheme over the following week, with different aspects of the fraud being implemented on specific days according to a carefully coordinated timeline. This advanced knowledge gave law enforcement the opportunity to intercept the criminals before they could complete their plan. The final confrontation came on Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after Detective Martinez had first spotted Chen in the community center's mess hall. Federal agents coordinated simultaneous raids on the warehouse facility and several other locations where Chen's associates were preparing to execute different aspects of their fraudulent scheme. Detective Martinez participated in the raid on the warehouse, where Chen was found with computers, printers, and thousands of pages of personal information stolen from the community center and other locations. The evidence was overwhelming, including detailed plans for identity theft, correspondence with other criminal networks, and financial records showing the proceeds from previous fraudulent activities.
Chen's arrest was surprisingly anticlimactic.
When federal agents surrounded the warehouse, he offered no resistance and seemed almost resigned to being captured. During his initial questioning, he displayed the same calculating intelligence that Detective Martinez remembered from their previous encounters, but there was also a weariness that suggested he understood that his criminal career was finally coming to an end. "You know, Detective Martinez," Chen said during one of their conversations after his arrest, "I always wondered if our paths would cross again. When I saw you in the mess hall that day, I knew it was only a matter of time." Detective Martinez was startled by this admission.
"You recognize me?"
Chen smiled with what might have been genuine amusement. "I make it my business to remember people who have caused me problems in the past. I saw you watching me, and I knew you would eventually figure out who I was. The question was whether I could complete my operation before you could stop me." This revelation meant that Chen had been aware of the surveillance from almost the very beginning, which explains some of his team's more cautious behavior during the final days of the operation. It also suggested that he might have accelerated his timeline specifically because he knew that law enforcement was closing in on him.
The investigation's conclusion brought mixed emotions for everyone involved.
On one hand, law enforcement had successfully prevented a large-scale identity theft scheme that could have devastated dozens of lives and cost victims hundreds of thousands of dollars in financial damages. Chen and his 3 associates were facing federal charges that would likely result in lengthy prison sentences, and the evidence collected during the operation had already provided leads for investigations in several other states. However, the case also highlighted the vulnerability of community institutions and the people they serve to sophisticated criminal exploitation. The community center had been targeted not because of any security failures or negligence on the part of its staff, but specifically because of the trust and openness that made it effective at helping people in need. Mrs. Hoffman and her staff worked tirelessly over the following weeks to restore confidence in the center's security and to provide support for visitors whose information had been compromised. They implemented new privacy protection measures, enhanced security systems, and created educational programs to help people protect themselves against identity theft and fraud. Detective Martinez found herself deeply affected by the case's implications. The routine search that had started with missing laptops and cash had revealed how easily criminals could exploit the very qualities that make communities strong: trust, openness, and mutual support. It was a sobering reminder that law enforcement's job wasn't just about catching criminals after they had committed crimes, but about protecting the social bonds that hold communities together. In the months that followed, several of the potential victims whose information had been stolen by Chen's operation contacted Detective Martinez to thank her for preventing what could have been financial disasters for their families. These conversations reinforced her understanding of how much damage identity theft can cause, not just in terms of money and credit ratings, but in terms of people's sense of security and trust in their community. Agent Torres kept Detective Martinez informed about the broader investigation that had grown out of Chen's arrest. The evidence collected during the community center operation had helped federal authorities identify and shut down similar schemes in 6 other states, leading to more than 20 additional arrests and the the recovery of stolen funds and property worth millions of dollars. Chen himself eventually pleaded guilty to federal charges of identity theft, fraud, and conspiracy, receiving a sentence of 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of early release. During his sentencing hearing, several of his intended victims spoke about the impact that his crimes would have had on their lives, and about their gratitude that law enforcement had intervened before irreparable damage could be done. One victim, an elderly man named Robert Chen who had been a regular visitor to the community center's social programs, addressed David Chen directly during the hearing.
"You targeted me because you thought I was vulnerable and alone," he said.
"But you were wrong. I'm part of a community that looks out for each other, and that community includes people like Detective Martinez who won't let predators like you destroy what we've built together." Detective Martinez was present for the sentencing hearing, and she was struck by how the case had evolved from a routine investigation into something that touched on fundamental questions about community, trust, and protection of vulnerable people. The tattoo that had first caught her attention had been the key that unlocked a complex criminal conspiracy, but the real story was about the resilience of people and institutions when they work together to protect each other. As she left the courthouse that day, Detective Martinez reflected on how a single moment of recognition, a glimpse of a partially visible tattoo during what should have been a routine search, had led to the prevention of a crime that could have destroyed dozens of lives. It was a reminder that in law enforcement, as in life, the most important moments often come disguised as ordinary routine, and the difference between success and failure often depends on being alert to details that others might miss. The community center returned to its normal operations, serving meals, providing services, and offering support to anyone who needed it. The mess hall continued to buzz with conversation and activity, and the table by the window where David Chen had conducted his surveillance became just another place where people could sit, eat, and find companionship with their neighbors. But, for Detective Martinez, that table would always serve as a reminder of how quickly routine can become extraordinary, and how a single observation by an alert law enforcement officer can mean the difference between a criminal's success and a community's safety. The routine search was over, but its lessons would inform her work for years to come. The case files were closed, the evidence was stored, and the criminals were sentenced, but the real victory was measured in the continued trust and openness of a community center that refused to let the actions of a few criminals destroy the bonds of mutual support that made it a lifeline for so many people in need.